So, in order of our speakers, our next speaker will be Yasmina Reggad. Yasmina is an independent curator and writer based in London who works between London and Algiers. She holds an MA in Middle Ages history from the Sorbonne University and is presently program curator at ARIA, last residency in Algeria, and was exhibition and projects manager at the Delphina Foundation. Reggard's research focuses on the politics of futurity. Oh, futurity. God, I'm learning new words a lot today. As well as alternative models of art education. I might explore that later on today. Her recent curatorial projects include a series of evening of performance at Delphina Foundation, UK, Puppet Master by Adrian Lee at Dutch Art Biennale, Algeria, Intervening Space, the Mosaic Rooms, Sketches of Algeria, and 1.554 Contemporary African Art Fair, UK. This year she conceived We Can't Be There, Emergency Provisions for Unanticipated Futures, a 6-month series of public events which took place at Goldsmiths University, Tate Modern, the Institute of Contemporary Art, and Delphina, UK. Reggad publishes essays and articles on contemporary art and takes part in several juries and is regularly called upon to participate in panel discussions and talks for institutions such as Delphina, Goldsmiths, Corner House, Sharjah Art Foundation in the UAE, Villa Arson in France, and Casa Tomada in Brazil. Our next speaker, let me see if I can get this right, Osei Bonsu. Oh, did I get it right? Oh, okay. With the cabin twang to it, possibly. Is a British Ghanaian independent curator and writer based in London. His writing has been included in a number of museum and exhibition catalogues, including the 56th Venice Biennale exhibition and Milan Expo Art and Food at La Triennale di Milano. He is the founder and director of Crane and has developed a number of projects focused on international art, including packing 2 new art from Africa and Latin America, Sacha Gallery 2015, and 1-54 Art Fair 2013-14. He advises private and non-for-profit art organisations and contributes to publications such as New African Art, NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, Moose Magazine, and Art Review, amongst others. Our third speaker is Melanie. Melanie Keane is, congratulations, currently director of INIVA, a visual arts organisation. One that I mentioned yesterday was first to collaborate and help support the Mirage initiative. So INIVA is a visual arts organisation that, through an exploration of the politics of race and global identities, creates exhibitions, publications, multimedia education and research projects. Prior to joining INIVA in September 2015, Melanie was a senior relationship manager at the Arts Council of England. Previously, Melanie was an independent curator and consultant. The curatorial projects include Figures of Speech for Film and Video Umbrella, Oscar Windsor, Mirror Image for INIVA, A Better Place with Erica Tan, and Melissa Bliss for the Bow Festival, 48 Hours with Jacqueline Donche and Mary Evans. I'm losing my space here. Mary Evans and Ella. Oh, this continues on another page. I can't even find it. Yeah, I need that. I need that last page. Where's my last page on that one? Did you take it? Okay, I'm going to go towards your last bit. She has contributed to several publications, including Changing States, a unique anthology of essays and artwork celebrating 10 years of INIVA, as well as a monograph on Faisal Abdul Allah. She has co-wrote Recordings, which is actually a great book, a selective bibliography of contemporary African and Afro-Caribbean and Asian British art with Elizabeth Ward, which I think was recently made into a series of exhibitions at the University Arts London. So that leads me to... This is what happens when you don't put things in order, isn't it? Last but not least, where's Greg? Hey. Greg de Cuir Jr. was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. He lives and works in Belgrade, Serbia as an independent writer, translator, and curator. Greg curated the film and video program Avant Noir and Avant Noir, Volume 2 for ICA. These 2 programs present alternative images of African cultures through progressive and experimental cinematic practices and also highlight artist of African descent. His talk today will deal with the aesthetics and politics of his curatorial intervention and the habeas corpus proposition that underwrites his efforts. And I would defy anybody who can give Greg a title of a film from the 1930s and 40s film noir era, and he will tell you, A, the nature of that film, and B, who were the first two stars of that film. If that's not the case, I'll give you a fiver. So let's welcome our speakers, and Yasmina, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon, sunny afternoon. Thank you, David, for the introductions. And thank you so much also for inviting me to join this symposium. As we are to talk about networks and circulation of agency this afternoon, I can only acknowledge the significant impact of David A. Bailey and International Curators Forum in my career as a curator, which started in 2008. And also you can blame David for what you will witness later on. So I say that because most of my network and mobility I owe to International Curators Forum, who took me to important events such as the Sharjah Biennial in the UAE, Alexandria Biennial in Egypt, and also the Bamako's Encounter in Mali. Actually, the Bamako's Encounter, just a parenthesis, it's opening today. So good luck to BC Silva. I'm sure it's going to be a great success. And also, well, with all these first trips, that's also when my carbon footprint started to go up. Thank you, David. So we are here today to look back at the legacy of the exhibition that David curated, Mirage, Enigmas of Race, Difference and Desire, which took place in 1995. In 1995, I wasn't living in the UK. I was living in France. And actually, it was my a year preparing an exam to enter the university. I don't have much knowledge of the context of which this exhibition, what was the context of the exhibition here in the UK. Instead, what 95 means to me is, and what I thought about when I was invited, it was more about the beginning of the commercialization of the internet, and also its access to a greater number of people, first in the US, but after that around the world. And also, and even the Vatican actually got online on that year. And I'm not sure how much this is a coincidence, the internet, accessibility to the greater number, with the title of our panel this afternoon. But I was quite intrigued actually by the term techno-diaspora. I had never heard this word before, only related to music actually, and precisely for this singer called Natasha Atlas, who's Belgian Moroccan. So I was very curious about it, and as long as I was speaking, I was supposed to speak about that. I started to research on this, and what I found very little. And later on, David told me that actually techno-diaspora is more called digital diaspora. So I was misled. So what I found was very interesting, actually, going through a quick research online. I came across the synopsis of a paper titled The Sociocultural Impact of Indian Call Centers by Amanda Mitra. And so Amanda Mitra was studying the impact of the transfer of North American and Western Europe phone service operations to India and China. And she found out through her research that outsourcing these services is producing a mercurial techno-diaspora in India, as well as a sense of displacement. And so why that? She said that Indian workers were adopting a new name or a specific accent to speak with people in the US, or in this case, mainly I believe in the UK. Or also generally they would hide their own identity. They would have to they would also have to respond to customers' needs by being acculturated to the West, and also adjust to customers' hours, with call centers operating with 5 to 10 hours difference between India, Western Europe, and the United States. So how do I relate this to myself? In the past 4 months, I have been working from 8 different countries. From the UK first, I left the UK actually in July for 4 months, but I was in the UK, in Portugal. I worked from Finland, from Turkey, from Greece, from the UAE, from Morocco. I came back to the UK. I went to France, and came back here for today's symposium. And somehow, and to a certain extent, I could relate to the experience of the Indian techno-diaspora. So, and I actually discovered that I was a call center myself, and I'm gonna prove it. So I'm going to share with you, maybe it was already, no, it's already here. Yep. So, where is the first? So all these datas. Okay, so I'm sharing with you all, it's 4 months worth of mobile phone and Skype roaming life and data, produced in the past 4 months then, and while working from abroad. I invite you to look, more at the places called and from where each time, so you can see the how I was working from abroad and where I was calling and from where. I haven't decided not to include emails or text messages because it doesn't involve the body or the voice or the language, and that was intentional. So here you can see that I moved. I was in Finland for curatorial residency. I went to Istanbul doesn't appear. Actually, you have to know that it didn't cost me a lot of money because it's free for me to call from continental Europe to European countries. Thank God. So Istanbul appeared just once because I didn't use the phone there. It's not Europe. Then I was in Istanbul for the Istanbul Biennale. I went to Greece, to Thessaloniki for the Thessaloniki Biennale, and then to Athens, where I will relocate a bit for a few months at the end of November. From Greece, I went to the UAE, to Dubai, for a research trip for a week. From the UAE, I traveled to Morocco, to Casablanca, to participate in a training for young curators. And then I came back to the UK for Freeze, and I went to France for FIAC. And I also put my Skype, all the Skype I did during, and they were with people from all around the world, artists from all around the world. So during this time, my best friend was the world clock on my iPhone, because I had to speak with a lot of artists in I don't know how many countries. I didn't count, and here some are missing. But instead of showing you, map, I decided that I would try to perform this archive of data and using my body. And here you were wondering maybe why there were these, the time zones representing on the floor. So I'm going to try to perform what I did, how I worked during this 4 months. Okay, it's the first time I'm doing it, so it's gonna be. So, I was in the UK in June 2015, and I was working at the time at the Delphina Foundation. I was working at Delphina Foundation, but at the same time I was appointed guest curator for Art Dubai Projects 2016. And I was also offered to be editor of a monograph of Algerian artist Zulikha Bouabdella, who lives in Morocco. So while I was in the UK, because of these jobs, and I had to Skype or call Zulikha Bouabdella, who's French-Algerian, but she was in Casablanca. And for the job in Dubai, I had to have a Skype meeting with 3 people, Skype conference, they call it, in Dubai. So with these 2 jobs in June, and I had planned to have a holiday in Portugal, so I had, it was a bit spoiled. So I had a busy summer ahead, and I had already planned to visit several countries for research trip or for the residency, like in Finland. So this time zone, as I said, I didn't want to use a map, but better I found out that the time zone would represent better, or translate better the movement I was doing myself, traveling between countries, but also the immobility of speaking with people from around the world, and also other mainly artists or curators, but also themselves who were in the same situation and weren't at the time in the countries they were working and living in. So I didn't know how. This is the time zones, the present one, because time we change from summer time, yeah. So it's not accurate. But right now, GMT, I am in the UK, and I went to Portugal. So in Portugal, for my work, I called artists in Paris. I called a colleague curator in Beirut, and an artist in the Netherlands who's actually Ecuadorian, but now lives in Amsterdam. And in this case, I was speaking Spanish. When I was calling France, I was speaking French, and when I was calling Beirut, this curator, I was speaking in French. Then from Portugal, I went to Finland, here. While in Finland, I was doing this residency, and I had to start working on the Art Dubai project selection of artists. So for this, I called several artists in France. And actually, these artists were Moroccan and Tunisian, and I was speaking French. I also called the Netherlands, the same artist, Ecuadorian artist, who's I was speaking in Spanish. I called also the UK in English, and Portugal in Portuguese. Then I was also speaking with an artist in Cairo, here. And I was in Finland, and I was speaking in English, and a bit of French, because she speaks French as well. Then I was also working with artists from Cairo, but they were in the US at the time, coming back from a residency in Cali, Colombia. So I go back to Finland. And I also had Skype meeting with Aaron Cesar, the director of Delphina Foundation in the UK, at the same time as I was also with Dubai. So Skype conference. So the three of us on Skype with Antonia Carver from Art Dubai. And that was in English. Then I traveled to Turkey for the biennial. And there I was on the final selection of Art Dubai artists, the UAE artists. For this, I had to Skype with run Skype interviews with artists in the in the UAE, but also in Saudi Arabia, in Italy, and also in Portugal, in Portuguese. The rest was in English. And I was also Skyped with a friend curator in Sharjah in the UAE in English. And she was, I think, one of the few, maybe the only one who had a British accent. Then from, I forgot where I was, in Turkey. So I had to stay longer in Turkey actually for working. I did visit the biennial, and so, but I had to stay longer to extend my trip to run this Skype interview with the UAE artist and other artists. Then from Turkey I went to Greece to the Thessaloniki biennial, and stayed a bit in Athens. From there, I was Skyping again, or phoning. No, I was phoning because it's still Europe, with Portugal in Portuguese, and also the UK in English. From Greece, where is Greece again? Here. From Greece, I traveled for a research trip to the UAE, and there I met with Aaron Cesar from London, Lydia Urahman from London, and she lives in between London and Algeria, and Rita GT from who lives and works between Portugal, Porto, and Luanda, Angola. So we met here. Then from the UAE, I went to Morocco for the training of the young curators. And there in Morocco, the young curators were all they were all francophone. So they were coming from Cameroon, from Algeria, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Morocco. And there I didn't call anyone, I didn't have the time, but we spoke mainly in French and in English. I don't speak Arabic. Others did speak Arabic. From Morocco, I came back to the UK for Frise, and from Frise I went to France for FIAC. And I am back now in the UK. So what I was trying to do here, I mean, I thought that this kind of display not only show the idea of networks, creating networks, and also, but also I discovered new centers actually, where I have met all my networks, which were Turkey, because of the Istanbul Biennial, so it became a center for networking and meeting my colleagues. Actually, I met all my friends from London or from France, from everywhere in Turkey. London is a center, as we know. Morocco as well actually became a center. Casablanca, with this meeting of 15 young curators from North Africa and Cameroon, and France with the FIAC. So the question really, I'm still, I wanted to perform it here, and so we could see more the movement of the body, and also the question of speaking with people who are in other places and being stable, sitting in front of of a computer, but still the body is involved and the voice is involved, the language as well is involved. And this is in a way how I felt a sense of displacement, maybe probably similar to the Indian techno diaspora. So I was wondering if I was myself part of this techno diaspora. The other question I wanted to raise, and I was wondering how much the new developments in information and communication technology can offer opportunity of amplifying the visibility and the participation of art practitioners, and particularly those with reduced mobility. And I'm talking about those ones who need a visa to travel. And I have to say that I have an old French passport, and I didn't need any visa actually to visit all these countries. Another question was, how do ICTs affect or transform the experience of migration, the networks and the circulation of agency in our day-to-day work in the arts? And also, the last question, and I hope we can discuss that in the panel, was is all these social media or ITs change or make operate a shift for all the concept and vocabulary related to post-colonial theory back in 95 or after 95? Thank you.
Can we dim the lights like it was for Lyle's presentation, only there's no music? Sorry. No Grace Jones. We were trying to think of what the British equivalent of a Grace Jones would be if one was to reminisce on those same moments, but in a British parallel. And I think Melanie said Soul to Soul, I said Sade. Maybe that's Jones on. So it's really a pleasure to be back here. I mean, I funnily enough had my first ever London job interview at the ICA, and didn't get it. So the irony is that I hope this goes better than that day did. So I've set the bar incredibly low. But I mean, the task of today's presentation, I guess the brief that was sent to me sometime around the beginning of this month was to think about 3 different headings, and those headings were, I believe, I mean, there were 3 and it got reduced to 2, and I'm still trying to figure out which one went missing. The body, yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, that's not what I'm going to talk about, so it's fine. But the networks of circulation and agency in the techno-diaspora is also not really what I'm going to address, because around the time I was thinking about what would be the best way to think about a possible presentation or a meaningful presentation in the context of a revisitation of Mirage, I started to reflect really on my own biography. And I think for very specific reasons that at the time, like Yasmina, I was doing a lot of traveling and a lot of moving around, and questioning to what extent London had... London, both my education in London, my education in Britain, my subjectivity as a Welsh Ghanaian, had impacted on my art historical writing, which is my primary mode of communication. So I kind of first wanted to thank Astrid, Catherine, and David, the incredible David A. Bailey, for making this symposium possible, but also to give David a certain, a note, just as a memo, that I didn't in fact get to see Mirage, but I'm sure that, I mean, what that must have meant for young artists, practitioners of Black and other origin at the time practicing in the UK must have been extraordinary, irrespective of whether... I'm surprised actually at how few of those participants came to revisit this moment of a 20-year revisitation. It seems strange with all of those participants. I'm assuming they're not all deceased, that they're not here. So anyway, I started to think about a particular quote from Black Skin, White Masks that was significant to me and that it stood out for so many reasons. It's not a book that I refer to very often, but it's a book that's kind of stayed with me. It's part of my intellectual biography, as it is, I think, anyone who's kind of gone through a post-colonial program. You know, it's really great that the lights are off because I can see who's on their phones. So I see you. So the quote, and this is very serious, all jokes aside. So this is from Fanon, and this was written in 1952. I am a man, and what I have to recapture is the whole pest of the world. I am not responsible only for the slavery of those in Santo Domingo. Every time a man has contributed to the victory of the dignity of the spirit, every time a man has said no to an attempt to subjugate his fellows, I have felt solidarity with this act. In no way does my basic vocation have to be drawn from the past of peoples of colour. In no way do I feel that I have to dedicate myself to reviving some black civilization unjustly ignored. I will not make myself a man of any past. My black skin is not a repository of specific values. Haven't I got better things to do on this earth than avenge the blacks of the 17th century? And I mean, what is so compelling about that particular quote is that it shows how conflicted Fanon's own intellectual mission was, and the extent to which I think he was constantly negotiating between the text and the self, between the objectivity or the seemingly objective narrative of history and his own kind of subjectivity as a thinking intellectual. So to begin with, I wanted to say that I wasn't going to address Fanon or Mirage directly because they're things about which I don't feel I know enough to address, but to really take this opportunity to lean not to take this opportunity to lean into 1995 as a historical moment, seemingly more meaningful and perhaps more urgent than the one we are currently living through. My ambition is to address history as a present tense, or rather an ongoing activity, as what's happening. I will endeavour to think historically in the present, or rather to think about the proximity of history as it persists within today's fractured and often indecipherable world. This, I should note, is not to refer to the political potentiality of nowness, urged by certain utopic illusions or by unrealised visions of a shared future, the kind we see asserting themselves in our everyday reality, so via social media and other forms of connectedness and networks and agencies that we've spoken about today. I will begin with something far more anecdotal, but I think less compelling than this idea, perhaps more sort of exigent, is this notion of addressing what might be at odds with the site specificity of cultural production or contemporary art, the contemporary art world as we know it, and yet what might also be out of kilter with the exactitude of race and its discourses as they prevail well into the 21st century. So, to begin with the anecdotal, for my history, whether I choose to acknowledge it or not, has brought me here today. So I should start by saying that around this time last year, I received an invitation not like the one that prompted my being here, and it was an invitation to submit to a catalogue on arts and food since 1851. And what I'm going to read to you is just the sort of introduction email that was sent to all of the prospective contributors. So the exhibition, which would take place at between April the 1st and November 1st, April 9th and November 1st, 2015, would be put on at La Triennale di Milano in Milan. It would be called Arts and Foods, and it would examine the multiplicity of visual cultures, sculptural, object-based and environmental languages that have revolved around food, nutrition and eating together ever since the Expo of 1851, so the Expo that took place at Crystal Palace in London, famously. And then the part that was addressed to me was this kind of strange final paragraph. So, in view of your profound knowledge on these issues, debatable, we would be greatly honoured if you would consider contributing an essay to this publication. Based on the preliminary overplan, it might concern food, and colonial and post-colonial art and cultures. We are, of course, open to any discussion and suggestions that might have that you might have as an approach to the adopted text. So, I mean, it's extremely vague, but what it dawned on me, I mean, the text come from a curator who, for me, has been an incredible mentor and a kind of force in my own life, which is Germano Celantu, the curator of arts and food. And needless to say, I accepted with alacrity on those grounds that it was Germano's invitation and not just some random. But the kind of interesting thing is that I was enthralled by these possibilities of plundering the history of art and food as it related to cultural production over the more than a century. But really kind of felt that there was something quite perplexing about the notion that I would somehow be tasked with the task of making sense of what art, food in the colonial/post-colonial context, how they might relate. So I was interested to see how these visions of art and food had manifested in the artistic imagination, but I wasn't sure how I was to approach them and whether I wanted to use the angle that had been set out for me, so to speak. So what was more is, having spent a sizable portion of my academic life engaged in the anti-formal aesthetics and the political rebellion of the post-war Italian movement, it kind of seemed strange to be invited to a platform in Italy to write about something that wasn't Italian art or Italian modernism. So that kind of created this sort of odd tension, and furthermore, I thought it would be an opportunity to think about a specific history more thoroughly, and yet I was being confronted with a discourse that I didn't feel I had a great deal much to say about it. However, something felt out of joint. I'm getting, back to the text, but perhaps this was a symptom of the looming deadline. It was an incredibly short turnaround, and the stark realization that one efforts to shed light on these epic themes would only ever be in vain. A well of doubt was beginning to form. Then came a thought that until then had never crossed my mind. Germano had never expressed an interest in the colonial or post-colonial and had no knowledge of my own interest in these specific discourses. Indeed, I had written about black artists, but what gave the curator the impression that I could be entrusted with unlocking this vital chapter in art history was beyond me. If not my received knowledge, it would have had to have been the fact of my blackness. A blackness which I would later learn would be in stark contrast from the wall of white European contributors spread across the book's page of contents. I should emphasize that up until then I had never considered writing about post-colonial or colonial art and culture. I had grown up around African art and admired black British artists without a sense of their implication within these historical narratives. Did my race mean that I could or even should be entrusted with a narrative that felt distant or somewhat undefined? To what extent does the legacy of the post-colonial art or art of the post-colonial belong to me or those whose ancestry could be rooted in its historical reality? Decades of productions of objects which spoke to both personal intimacies, collective traumas, struggles for liberation, and cries for slavery, about which I felt I knew everything and nothing. In the absence of the lack of a unified canon, or in the absence of a unified canon, I was forced to recognize that I myself had never considered how one might look down the long lens of art history through a post-colonial gaze. This, as you might imagine, remains less a concern to the art historical discipline as it's practiced in the UK, and is seen as something that belongs more so to the old arena of cultural studies or to the blooming fields of interdisciplinary practice such as museum studies and curatorial studies. While I had managed to remain intellectually unaware of my own capacity to think as a post-colonial subject, it had never seemed appropriate to reflect on something as matter-of-fact as race in relation to the longue durée of colonialism and its unrelenting legacies. So what it made me question is the extent to which my direct experience was related to my own historical writing and to what extent I was implicated as a subject or that my ancestors had a claim to the art historical writing that I'd been investing in. So what I would write in the end, which was an essay called And Still Lives, Food and Desire in the Post-Colonial Imaginary, and it I guess tried to some extent to deal with the work of Lebena Himid, Rotimi Fani-Kode and Yinka Shinibare as reflecting on still life painting. It seemed like a kind of negotiation between the European canon and the post-colonial bar that was set. but there was something incredibly unsatisfying about having to write that text with I felt not enough information. I mean, you know, it's such a huge amount, and I mean, you know, David's research will attest to it, but so many others in this room, an extensive body of knowledge that people have spent at times entire lifetimes devoted to. So in what became a moment of self-actualization, I felt an existential loss of self, of authentic authorship, and of agency. To what extent had my race, or the race to which I am thought to have belonged, impacted my historical subjectivity? Is the position of self-reflexivity even useful in terms of dealing with the unchanging past? Perhaps there is no alternative but to leave history behind and to make oneself scarce, which I should have said is the title of my presentation, to make oneself scarce. But it's a kind of working essay, so these thoughts are sort of forming, but aren't in any way fixed in stone, so I'm open to having people question them and criticizing them. But that... So to make oneself scarce might be an option, and by that I don't mean rendering one's subjectivity invisible, but the possibility of losing oneself in order to find a reimagined past. The eroding space between the status quo and the avant-garde seems evident, as does the fixity between a canonical art history with which we've been left pretty much for a large portion of the 20th century, and now we're dealing with a kind of certain hangover, and then the possibility of endless alternatives that might return as a certain alternative to this kind of canonical structure we're still dealing with. So when dealing with history, absence becomes much stronger when it's thought of along the axis of these sorts of theories of scarcity. What it might help us indeed reach a kind of more nuanced version of this relationship between history and subjectivity as a way of attending to absence, but also realizing the potential of future identities. So in the final part, I think that, you know, that maybe the task of intellectuals within this framework is to think about the way in which the 21st century has liberated all of these possibilities, the privilege, and some might argue the burden, for us to edit, direct, and produce reality TV shows of our own making, made in accordance with our own candid dreams, public desires. One might seek to liberate this new potential to an increasingly virtual world. More than simply producing an endless void, and this is referring to the internet, out of which we might pull facts, images, and data to back up or make sense of our real lives, technology, much like history itself, might be the resource through which we might illuminate the scarcity of self in relation to history, superimposing our present selves onto our collective past in order to make better sense of the historical conditions through which we live. Making oneself scarce, finally, may also be a way of, a means of freedom to explore the conditions under which different kinds of futures have been made, will be made imaginable. To let go of identification that positions blackness as the West's best critic, and here, you know, you're referring to figures like Obama as this black man as the authentic narrator or the rightful negotiator of meaning. Within the conditions of the Western world, or even more so, and this was certainly my position, in the entrusted narrator of the post-colonial story as it unfolds into the 21st century. I question myself, relations of networks and circulation to enable us to think about the past as a site for unpacking the self and what it means to make oneself scarce. Sorry, I'm losing my words, is to provoke a notion of leaving one's identity behind. And I think that is certainly an enticing proposal, particularly when we're sort of lamenting the death of identity politics for whatever reason, for various reasons. I'm sure everybody has a different finger to point. So while lots of identity politics that took place in the 1980s felt extremely bodied, relating directly to race or gender, we are witnessing this new form of self-fashioning, self-imagining, new categorizations of subjectivity, quite detached from history, but ultimately formed by the nexus of history and subjectivity, and a departure away from those dominant narratives that came to define the colonial subject, towards the discovery of what I'm calling a dehistoricized self, which is a self that lacks importance, but in that lack of importance, there is a kind of value added, because it's seemingly to think of oneself as an agent of contemporaneity and as an actor and an engagee within the now, as opposed to some kind of, as Fanon said, a kind of compromised figure of post-colonial legacy. So that's my presentation in short, and thanks so much for listening.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to David and Catherine and Astrid and everybody that organized this. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all being here. You see the topic of my talk, habeas corpus ad subjiciendum. This is the theme of what I want to deal with today. So the translation of which being, you should have the body. And I will talk about bodies, that sort of missing link that disappeared from our panel discussion today, so I'm going to bring it back. This refers, of course, to a legal writ that demands discipline and punished bodies should have their day in court. And this is also known as a great writ, or the great writ. And it implies a great ethical proposition. You should have the body, meaning that your moral well-being is at stake and you have a chance to correct a grave error, possibly. It also implies a great polemic, I think. You shall have the body, meaning the first step in a continuous action or program that may ultimately overturn the state of things. So the counselor that invokes this great writ challenges the hegemonic principles that structure society, and I think this is the very greatness of its potential. The second half of this medieval Latin phrase that we're dealing with right here, utilized in this legal discourse, ad subjiciendum, meaning subject to an analysis. So the body must be read. Perhaps this is a physical body, perhaps this is a body of work, but it must be decided where and how the body should exist. And I think this is one of the questions that Fanon was most concerned with when he was assessing the state of the colonial world. Now, before the body can be had, before it can be analyzed and either disciplined or liberated, of course, it must be seen. So this is a question of representation, which is also a political question. It's a question that can be adjudicated, I think, in the domain of the visual arts, but particularly the cinema. That's what I do, film and video. That's what I want to talk with you about today. The cinema which conjures these living images that have an indexical tie to reality. Now, Ralph Ellison wrote that the invisible man was so simply because people refused to see. Could it be that we refuse to see, even in the cinema? This can be an ideological and ethical block rather than a physical one. But I think habeas corpus counters this refusal, and it demands that people look and sort of acknowledge the other. So today what I want to do is talk about this body and how it relates to new alternative film and video practices within African cultures and the diasporas. But before I do that, I should actually preface this by saying that my specialty is Eastern European cinema. That's usually what I deal with. Histories, aesthetics, politics. But I've been developing a new program recently with a colleague that traces the history of the Black image in alternative film and video. And our working title for this program is Take This Hammer. So it's critical curating, I like to think. But last year here at ICA, and even this year, I embarked on an effort at propositional curating that was designed to sort of expose this invisible other, to have the body present in places that it doesn't normally visit. So I was responding to what I felt was a deficiency, what I'm sure a lot of you and my colleagues feel was a deficiency. So let me throw out another Fanon quote. He wrote that, "I can't go to a film without seeing myself. I wait for me." I love that. These bodies and questions that I wanted to deal with, of course, were Black bodies. Now, 20 years ago in this space, the exhibition Mirage was mounted as something of a critique of the invisibility of certain individuals, identities, bodies in the art world. At least that's what I assume. I wasn't there, but that's what it sounds like. 20 years later, I found myself confronted with a continued lack of representation in alternative film and video practices. That's both in front of and behind the camera, also in the curatorial role. So the cinematic avant-garde has exhibited a racial uniformity and a lack of inclusion throughout history, which is of course sort of ironic given its so-called committed and progressive stance. That's in terms of aesthetics and also in terms of politics. The surrealist group of France called this murderous humanitarianism, and I think they were right and onto something there. So my proposition was to simply wave away this mirage of uniformity and to present black bodies in alternative cinema circles, to make the invisible visible and to sort of transform this avant-garde into an avant-noir. Now, to curate means to be responsible for the care of souls. And that's much, much more important than to be responsible for the care of artworks. Curation is also a medium to sort of move between the body and the soul, to move the body and the soul. And if so, we can probably call that habeas spiritus. Cinema is the ideal form of expression for such a writ. I'm going to quote the Russian Soviet cineast Vsevolod Pudovkin, who noted that cinema is the greatest teacher because it doesn't just teach through the mind, it teaches through the whole body, throughout the whole body. This is a haptic pedagogy that's exercised by the film and video artists that I wanted to assemble in this program. And I think they utilize the body in a variety of ways to analyze the desire to see, the need to see, and the responsibility that's attached to these visions. So what I want to do is discuss some of these artists and works that I included in the program, just to get a little bit more specific, and also to talk about some of these really interesting pieces that they've made. So my first example is not that. There it is. This is a film called Reckless Eyeballing, and it was made by Christopher Harris in 2004. It's an archival piece that mobilizes footage of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, Pam Grier in the blaxploitation era, and images of revolutionary black activists. Those same activists at that time that were probably dealing a lot with Fanon and influenced by him and trying to sort of enact some of his principles and his theories. So the eyeball of the title in this film conjures the body in of course, an immediate way, but I think it also calls forth the politics of visual pleasure in cinema, as accounted for by people like Laura Mulvey, who we talked about yesterday in her canonical essay. So of course, when we talk about Mulvey, she wrote from a feminist perspective, and she was concerned with power relations on the screen, behind the screen, but also between the screen and the audience. She was also primarily concerned with narrative cinema as the dominant form of the medium, but notably, she wasn't so concerned with the racial politics of visual pleasure, or maybe not concerned enough. Now, what Harris does that's interesting is he conducts this experiment on narrative cinema, editing his film in a manner that sort of induces Pam Grier to gaze across generations, across films, across spaces at her male counterparts in these other segments. And her gaze, I think, here is both empowering and accusatory. So she analyzes these actors in blackface in Griffith's reactionary epic, and also she's analyzing these representatives of the Black Power movement who are seated at a table, I might note, with no women present. So perhaps Grier finds a farce in both. It's fitting that Harris offers this great writ of habeas corpus to Grier specifically because she's an actress who was so often objectified and fetishized because of the uncommon beauty of her body. So this is one great ironic reversal that we should really exemplify and keep in mind with these other examples. Her reckless eyeballing usurps the male gaze, and it refracts any visual pleasure into sort of an indictment. Now, there's one other significance to this term reckless eyeballing, which links to the era of Griffith's film. This is a term that was used in the Old South to refer to the act of a black man gazing at a white woman's body. Now, in the antebellum South, and honestly even as recently as the 20th century, that was an offense that no great writ could liberate any black body from. The punishment was a show trial by a jury of unfit peers, which resulted in a torturous death. In addition to a precarious physical well-being, black men had to suffer a debilitating double consciousness to be invisible to the world and to also make the world invisible to you, to blind yourself. Because to be reckless with your eyesight was to be reckless with your life. Harris explores this optical fatalism through the media of cinema as an art form, and I think through the body as this objective correlative of the cinema. So the second example that I would like to introduce to you is not that one, but this one. This is a film called Intermittent Delight by Akosua Odoma Uwosu from 2007, which is another archival piece. and it juxtaposes commercial advertising images and images of factory labor that underwrite the products for sale. So here we notice the dialectical impulse, I think, of Fanon's black skin and white masks, which echoes that double consciousness that we've been talking about, in reference to W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, and what he theorized in The Souls of Black Folks. In Owusu's film, black bodies are depicted laboring, while white bodies are depicted in dance, sort of enjoying the fruits of that labor. Now, this is another ironic reversal, particularly when we consider Fanon's writing on the colonial subject, the body, and particularly his writing on dance. So Fanon wrote that the emotional sensitivity of the native is kept on the surface of his skin. But in this film, the natives sort of sit passive behind their machines. And in many cases, their bodies are fractured by this layered mise-en-scène that Owusu sort of plasters throughout her film. It's actually the white bodies that burst free in a passionate dance in this sort of ecstatic display. Now, Fanon thought that the phenomenon of dance should really be given careful consideration in the colonial world, because the circle of dance is permissive and it protects. But in this film, it actually permits the flow of transnational capital, and it protects the hegemony of the colonizers. Now, Owusu doesn't necessarily give a free pass to the white bodies in her film. Theirs is a dance that they're ultimately not in control of because they're sort of possessed by the laws of commerce. So even their dance serves a master. It's a self-destructive dance. And I think we would do well here to remember Marx's famous proposition that the bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers. And as such, that's really the delight that's referenced in the title of this film, and that's why it can only be intermittent. The third example that I would like to give to you is a video called Lego Sand Merchants by Karima Ashadu, which was made in 2013. And this is an exploration of working bodies in Nigeria as they lumber back and forth with these large quantities of sand that they're sort of hoisting above them. Ashadu frames this exploration through a handmade camera rig that's composed of two large wooden wheels that you can sort of see on the edge of the frame there. And these two large wooden wheels sort of roll the camera in this grand 360-degree motion. So the effect is a tumbling, shifting view of work as carried out by these sand merchants. The black bodies on display in this video, often half-clothed, they sort of form a corollary to Owusu's film, which is mostly populated by female workers. Now, we can say here that a different visual pleasure is enacted. The camera movements inflect the repetitive actions of the workers, and it sort of joins them in their labor. The circle of the dance is again evoked. Of course, this time it's performed by the camera as an static mechanical body. The video directly corresponds, I think, to an important statement made by the theorist Bill Nichols when he was talking about nonfiction cinema. When he said that these nonfiction cinematic forms, they insist on the presence of the body, and they sort of exert a relentless demand of habeas corpus. But what I would like to ask is, what do we do with those bodies when we have them? And how do we nurture the souls within them? How do we express our solidarity with those who are not allowed to be seen, those who are not allowed to see? So my method in curating this program was really to present the Black alternative image by both African artists and artists of non-African descent. And I wanted this to be an inclusive collection, a sort of a constructive dialogue in a way that people can be brought together to sort of find a common ground. It should be noted when we talk about methods that Fanon was very suspicious of them, thinking that methods were really only suited for mathematicians or botanists, so on and so forth. Indeed, he wrote that there's a point at which methods devour themselves. So perhaps the method that I've employed in curating this series will also exhaust itself, but I think that could be a good thing. 20 years ago, we needed to conjure a mirage to speak about black bodies, black art, black artists. And 20 years later, this mirage is not enough. I think we should and we must have the body. So 20 years ago, actually I was 20 years old. And I didn't care about any of this stuff. But when we watched that film last night, Black Skin, White Masks, which I saw probably almost 20 years ago when I was in film school, I recognized myself. That was my story. I didn't have to wait to see me. So that's the proposition really that I want to lie at the heart of this curatorial project that I'm working on and future ones, and I hope it will. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're hanging on in there. I think to go last can be both a blessing and a curse. Thank you, David, Astrid, and Catherine for inviting me. And I say a blessing or a curse because there's been so many great speakers beforehand. I have scribbled over my talk and will make all variations of interjections based on some of those comments that were made earlier today. So I'm going to sort of sidestep the question, which was in the kind of paragraph to the introduction of this session, which was about what a new contemporary internationalism might look like, because it's the sort of thing that actually keeps me awake at night in my new role. And so I'm going to focus more on... Sorry, can I close this? Because I want to do a different slideshow. Yeah, that's fine, thanks. More on alliances and... Ooh, this might go a little bit wrong, so just bear with me with the slideshow. I want to focus more on alliances and collaborations, different models of resistance through affiliations, both digital and analogue, which are emerging in contemporary artistic practice. So I want to take on board some of the things that were spoken about earlier about being polyvocal, the notion of the trialectic, when I take the approach to my presentation. So I read a recent interview with Paul Gilroy in an article in the New York Times. And he was asked how black people from the States and the UK might create new forms of solidarity and collective activism that confront racism. And he said, and I quote, "Solidarity is an altogether trickier thing. It has to be made rather than assumed on racial grounds. The effects of racism are insufficient to maintain solidarity." So, with that health warning in mind, I want to present some episodic scenarios. Some some issues that are recently and consistently rehearsed in the media, posit some observations on the ways in which artists give agency to contemporary issues, and perhaps through a Fanonian filter, we can begin to assemble a set of tools or develop apparatus that we need to formulate questions, as well as consider a set of aesthetic propositions, which might unleash different models of resistance. Okay, so episode 1, 9th of August 2014, the United States. 18-year-old Michael Brown is shot dead in Ferguson, Missouri. Riots break out following his death. On the 25th of August, Michael is buried, and an estimated 4,500 people attend his funeral. Art historian Darby English was appointed in 2014 as a consulting curator in the painting and sculpture department of MoMA, New York. And he was helping the museum look in a black direction. In a recent talk at Tate Liverpool on revisiting the American canon, he coined the term an aesthetics of integration, which got people in the room really excited. When asked exactly what this would look like, he used an anecdote to begin to describe what will clearly be an ongoing piece of work. In light of Michael Brown's murder and the rising heat in America and the hideous state of anti-black state-sanctioned racial violence, he wanted to create a rupture in the hermetically sealed space of the museum. He rummaged through the works in MoMA's collection, falling through the chasms caused by major historical gaps, and found this work by Benny Andrews from 1970 called No More Games. He hung it in a discreet space. It was the lobby of the 4th floor wing of the Museum of Modern Art, not a particularly visible space, and this too has caused some consternation. But in spite of this, what started as a thoughtful intervention turned into a viral sensation. Instagram posts and reposts. Andrew's work, which was inspired by social turmoil of the civil rights movement at home and the Vietnam War abroad, tapped into the fraught sensibilities, racial tensions, and creeping nationalistic fervour pervading contemporary North American society. So this is part of my episode 2, the 22nd of August 2014 in the States. In UK. Artist Barbie Asante employed Horace Ove's film Baldwin's Nigger from 1969 as a starting point to consider the dialogue and the setting of the event within a contemporary context. In the film, James Baldwin's proposition broadly is to discuss race as if there were no white people in the room. The reconfigured project, Baldwin's Nigger Reloaded, explored and researched the subject of identity, thinking through a larger historical discourse outside of the mainstream histories. Asante worked with a group of young people to research, develop, and perform and digitally disseminate findings to peers over the summer of 2014. Through a number of research-focused performative responses, creation of new works, deploying multiple platforms and networks, Barbie worked collaboratively with the newly formed Sorry You Feel Uncomfortable collective to think through the legacy of black intellectuals and their ideas within the context of the world today. This gave space for the collective to think about their contemporary context and the legacy of their thoughts on the film. In considering new models of resistance through affiliations, both digital and analogue, Baldwin's Nigger Reloaded offers up a number of possibilities. From its initial performance at Rivington Place, it has been restaged, repurposed. It's now in its second iteration across multiple sites within England. So Nottingham Contemporary, Tate Liverpool, the Showroom Gallery, October Gallery. It's a live performance, it's a reenactment, it's an online platform, it's an incubator for new work, writing, thinking. It's live and it's evolving. Episode 3, 12th of April 2015, United States. Freddie Gray is arrested in Baltimore, Maryland. 7 days later, on the 19th of April, he dies of his injuries whilst in custody. On my Facebook timeline in May 2015, I see a post from the artist Barbie Asante, who enthusiastically posts on Facebook. I have to say, I consider her to be an activist in that regard. The post points to a newspaper article which asks, why is America celebrating the beating of a black child? A mother is lauded publicly for hitting her son in the middle of a riot in Baltimore in the wake of Freddie's death. I noticed a link in this article entitled Freddie Gray's Life, a study in the sad effects of lead paint on poor blacks. The article draws a chilling picture of Freddie's early life to adulthood, the damning trajectory of which is cast in stone even before he attends primary school, due to his blood being poisoned by lead, and it's a fact which is well documented in court reports. It's understood now by healthcare professionals campaigners that a child poisoned with lead is 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, as Freddie did. There is an archaeological, archival dimension to the unravelling of facts, to understanding the lives of young black men and women, the reports, the graphs, the diagrams, the maps, the murals, the placards, the posters, the T-shirts reveal a political iconography. Who speaks on behalf of Freddie now? Activists, class warriors, freedom fighters, Black Lives Matter. These point to the communicative resources of social media and how visual culture is entangled with politics and vice versa. Obviously, bear in mind that most of this material is gathered from the web, so if you think of it as an archive, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We understand now that Freddie was a victim of physical assault on multiple levels throughout his life. There is so much more to understand about the potency of signs and symbols and how they can be harnessed to recuperate the traumatised black body. Episode 4, 19th November 2015, UK. In August 2015, a Sudanese man, Abdul Rahman Haroon, aged 40, made the perilous journey through the Channel Tunnel from Calais, where trains can travel up to 100 miles per hour. He was the first person ever to reach Britain on foot via the 31-mile tunnel. On arriving in Folkestone, he was arrested and charged under the Malicious Damage Act of 1861. The depths of human sorrow, the capacity for survival endurance is incomprehensible. 13 people have died trying since June. This is a still from a work in progress by an artist called Alia Syed. She's attempted to reenact Mr. Haroon's journey, traversing the length of the Rotherhithe Tunnel in London, filming her every step and jagged breath. Her film will form part of a discrete intervention at INIVA Stuart Hall Library in November. Using her first-person perspective, I feel that she's also attempting to create a psychic affiliation with Mr. Haroon and his cause and act as a witness to him literally in court in a way that no court stenographer, blogger or journalist can do. Alia's work responds to John Berger and Jean Moore's book, The Seventh Man, to examine the hopes and fears that are driving the movements of current migrants and refugees. Her work is part of a larger project, which is led by sociologist Nirmal Purwar, focusing on the ways in which dreams, hopes, and aspirations are enfolded into the experiences of migration and exile, specifically the disjuncture between the dreams and the nightmarish realities. So this has been a bit of an experiment, and I think lingering within each of these 4 episodes is my curiosity about the role of artists as political agents operating within national and global context. And I'm curious as to how visual culture rising from acts of social agitation can be deployed to greater effect and seep through different channels. Thank you.
If you thought it couldn't get any better this morning, well, I think it actually did this afternoon. You just kind of like up that game. So again, lots to discuss, but also lots of questions kind of raised, and really to get a sense of, I suppose, a question to kind of think about all of you to respond to before we go into kind of an audience Q&A. I'm quite interested in. I'm going to start with Greg, but before I start with Greg, let me just kind of think about a recap. So, again, Yasmina, great. I love the idea of actually following on from Lyle's archive, your Skype archive. I thought was brilliant, and also. Yeah, the curatorial time zones and your performance within that is very much, if anybody who's travelled at that level, who's done the kind of Biennale circuit, would be very familiar with that. But also I like the way in which you kind of personalise that with yourself in the body in relation to that. But before I go there, you lot were like so punk today, so Fanon punk, like, we're not going to do this, we're going to do that. I'm going to that's like so punk Fanon, that's just untrue. If there's such a phrase, or I just invented the phrase. I love, Osei, the idea that somehow working through some of Fanon's ideas, but also using his question of like belongingness and also identification to talk about your own kind of scenarios. And particularly within that kind of notion that you describe, the post-colonial kind of canon and gaze, and also raising questions within that. I like the idea of like making one scarce, that question that came out of that. Great, the habeas corpus, love the idea, but I love the idea about bringing back the body. But also, I love the idea in which almost bringing back the body with a kind of post-Harlem Renaissance sensibility, i.e., love the idea you're bringing back in Du Bois' double consciousness, a post kind of like Richard Wright, Invisible Man, and thinking about how important it is for the body not to be seen, but to be read. And I think there's lots there to think about in relation to that. Melanie, I mean, again, just thinking about, love the idea of like the Fanonian filter. I thought was quite a nice phrase in which one can look at these current episodes which you described, and somehow how this filter is still quite relevant in terms of reading this kind of material, but also trying to make the connections between. It's almost like you can think about how Fanon talks about the notion of violence and racial violence in Algeria, and then you can transpose that to the idea of kind of what you described about racial violence in America with young black men, but also thinking clearly that it doesn't end there. One has to make that connection within a contemporary art world context, which I thought was quite important in relation to that. So again, thank you all for kind of that kind of richness within that. I suppose my question would be around the question that's always around in cinema, which is why I wanted to kind of not begin with Greg, but to kind of take my cue from Greg. And I think the French phrase is mise en scène, the idea of the direction of the scene. And it's quite clear that in Black Skins, White Masks, Fanon describes his personal mise en scène within all these different scenarios, and then tries to somehow draw parallels or make a connection with these personally, nationally, and transnationally. And so my point to you, and I think all of you have relate that to your work, is how important now is that thinking in terms of developing that as an idea. The idea somehow we all have now these kind of personal mise en scènes that we are developing, and how important now is to map these out within a kind of personal agenda, a national agenda, and a kind of a trans-international agenda at the same time. Or was that just a mad question to throw out there? Yes, that is a mad question to throw out there. But it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And my mind has been like feverishly. Too mad of a question.
Yeah, it's a hard question because you actually started with probably the most mistranslated concept in terms of film studies and film theory, this idea of mise en scène. What does it really mean? Does this mean, in terms of cinema, does this mean the placement of bodies, the arrangement of bodies and objects in space? Does it mean the arranging of decor? Is it the organization of shots and the composition of shots? And what are the politics of this mise en scène, the aesthetics? How do we talk about this? You actually raised probably the most difficult question.
But I think you nailed it on the head from the quote from Fanon, the cinema quote. I can't reread that. He says, I go to the cinema. I mean, at one point he talks about watching Tarzan, but in that quote that you've used, it's the famous one where he says, I wait for me, Yeah. So he's actually talking about he's waiting for the mise en, he's waiting for the moment. Whereas when we talk about mise en scène, it's like we're trying to describe the moment. He's actually waiting. He knows it's coming.
Yeah.
He's waiting for it, and he's trying to figure out, well, actually, how do I respond to that?
Yeah, that's what I love about the quote. This weight is at the heart of what I was trying to propose with this project that I curated. Actually, this weight was the impetus for the project. Okay, I'm ready to see me. I'm working at an avant-garde film festival in Eastern Europe. I'm traveling to other film festivals, both avant-garde and narrative feature film, so on and so forth. I'm looking at the history of these cinemas, dealing with people that are dealing with the histories of cinema. Okay, I'm waiting to see me. And that desire, that weight sort of fueled the need to create this program. But for me, it's at least about shortening the wait. I'll give an example. So when we saw Fanon's film last night, you know, I see myself immediately in this film. I remember the film. I hadn't seen it in a really long time. It was really nice to see it in an excellent transfer, restored. But, you know, I didn't have to wait. I see myself immediately. That's the type of cinema I'm interested in. But I don't say that only to say that my wait shouldn't, you know, it should be immediate. It shouldn't take some time. I believe anything worth having is worth working for, and sometimes it takes time to get. I'll give another example, actually, from earlier today, from Lyle's wonderful presentation, and this sort of sequence of slides that he put together. And by the time I sort of got into this cinematic flow that you were creating, if I'm not mistaken, that's not necessarily a film. That's sort of a sequence of still images that you composed for this presentation. Yes. But for me, okay, let's talk about mise en scène, because now you created it. At a certain point, I got into this cinematic flow. But then I was thinking about this Fanon quote, I'm waiting for me. And I'm waiting. I didn't see myself immediately, but I knew I was going to see myself. And then it happened. I saw myself. I recognized myself. Not to mean that I couldn't get into the film and the flow through other entry points, but somehow I felt assured that I would see myself. I waited, and I eventually did. And at that moment, I was sort of sutured into the film. Okay, we talk about mise en scène, we talk about suturing, but this wait, it doesn't have to be immediate, but I would like to think that my proposition or my impulse for curating this program was really just to shorten that wait, because I don't want to wait. I can't wait forever. I can wait a little bit, but not forever.
Does anybody else want to comment upon? Don't have to actually, but just if anybody wants to. Okay, that was a tough one, wasn't it? Okay, I'm going to go to audience. Any questions from the audience? Lyle.
Oh, I just have a brief comment. It's really wonderful hearing all the presentations. I had a question for Yasmina. Was that your first performance, you said, or first time performing this?
It's the first time performing this.
Okay, no, I really appreciate it. One question it raised to me: where does the idea of pleasure in travel? Because your performance evoked a well-known art piece by Sanamo Kogetto called Long Distance Lover, which is prior, which showed at Manila a few years ago. I think was actually initially created at the Student Museum in Harlem, where she actually very similarly documented a relationship, let's say, with a lover over several continents. And I'm wondering, with these several time zones that you're occupying, where does the realm of pleasure, desire fit into the particular, in a way, play out? Because I found that I was longing for that, or reverie, or dreams, or the watering hole, the bar. I'm wondering, how does that fit into this particular narrative that you perform for us?
I can't say that there were much pleasure. Actually, the desire came from the others, my friends or my colleagues, and they thought that it was very pleasant to do these trips, but I felt I found it very difficult. And what I forgot to say actually was, when I was talking about languages and speaking with all these people on Skype, not seeing them really, it was just the voice, and that they didn't really know where I was. I was phoning from this UK number. I was in Finland or I was in Greece. And that's why I wanted to perform it, with my body, that I was present. I was present there in Finland. And they were somewhere, but it was just a voice, and so it was very disturbing that no one would ask where I was. It was obvious for them that I was, but it's very strange. I speak English with a French accent, so it's also disturbing for them to think that I'm in the UK. So it was a disturbing 4 months, and so that's what. It wasn't very. Sometimes, of course, there were, but there weren't the pleasure of the traveling when it's for holiday. No. It was work.
No, I completely agree, and I can identify with that. I think it was a really it was a very good performance, but in terms of taking, and I'm speaking to you as, let's say, someone who's interested in performance or someone else, that, because even the idea of a burp, or let's say where one is, let's say, relieving oneself, there is, that is about the body, because you're saying it's about the body, but I felt there was an absence of the body, because I felt in a way
Of course it was the absence.
Yes, I felt like in a way that it would have been interesting to explore those moments, you know. Yeah, I mean, it'd be curious.
I totally agree with you. The idea of having my body here was to reflect on this absence of the body, actually. It was that I never felt that I was somewhere, or home, or I don't know how to call it, but that's why also I was thinking about all these concepts of places, mapping, cartography, displacement, or the body in regard to post-colonial theory. And it was the first time for me that I made this relation. I had never before. But it was also interesting because usually people think of me that I would make this relation according to my background. But it wasn't at all related to my Algerian background, but it was more related to the absence or the presence of the body. Mm-hmm. So we back to the mise en scène.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
George, did you want to say something?
Revised what I wanted to say to begin with. Just make just two small comments. One is the waiting, and I'm thinking with through Miles Davis. I waited for you. I'm always waiting. I'm always waiting for an invitation. I'm waiting for the dinner party to occur. I'm waiting. And that waiting is to do with not the body not being really there. It always feels like someone else's story. Maybe that's something to do with Europe. Right? So it's a question in that way, the staging of the event. Travel, pleasure. I wonder, if I'm cruising, if I receive a phone call, I don't think I'm going to tell anybody, where are you? I'm cruising. And maybe that's the thing about curation. Not curatoriality is the side of production of knowledge, which interests me, but that the cruising that takes place in the airports and the different hotels and so on. So it seems to me, with my kind of scopophilic fantasies following Fanon, the question is not waiting to see yourself in the moment is what is at stake, seems to me. So like you, Greg, I quarrel with mise en scène, but for different reasons. For me, I'm interested in the arrangement of the moment, the staging of the event, the rehearsal of a jazz piece, not the performance at the end of the day. So I come to it in that way.
Yeah. It's a better way of answering. That's better. That's a better way of saying my question, actually. The actual staging, rather than mise en scène, is part of that. It's about the staging and being part of that stage and being part of that drama. And a lot of what Fanon talks about is about being part of a drama. He talks about and being part of that stage drama, which I felt came a lot out of your presentations, particularly Melanie, when you just described how the staging of all these kind of black men being killed and the relationship between that. Definitely, also when you were talking about the relationship about being commissioned to write something, about being staged, about doing something else and having to step back from that drama and think through what that means. And obviously, Yasmina, your piece about staging yourself through these different time zones as well. So yeah, let's just put the mise en scène to one stage and bring it back to kind of a notion of staging in relation to that. Any more questions? Back. Is that the man with the cute dog?
Yes. Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to thank everybody, all 8 of you today. It was an absolute pleasure, each and every one of the papers. I really enjoyed all of them. I guess my question is geared more towards the body and probably will overlap because I'm trying to frame it in my head before I speak it. And this morning we saw, I think it was Ivan's image of the young black woman with their mouth gagged and almost muzzled in an animal-like fashion. And she mentioned as well something which I've always thought is a fantastic way to think about how you actually enter into the idea of identity, and that is that in order to police people, you have to be able to describe them, which brings us back into the whole history of language. And the time period of the 17th century in particular was a very significant time in relation to notions of Teutonic values, supremacist values, Protestant religious preaching, and all of the slavery that went with that. Roland Barthes had a very good template for it, where he distinguished between the paternal language and the mother tongue, where really the paternal language is the one of administration. And you are literally gagged when in a particular historic context. Now, I've always, since the 80s, relished that. I mean, when I started reading that stuff like Fanon, I just couldn't get enough of it. And I just want to ask now, 20 years on from 1995, what are you guys' views of contemporary approaches to the visual register in particular? I mean, the mise en scène is very interesting as well, because I think there's a big distinction between what's written and what's experienced through other senses, as well as sight in the visual register. But to bring it up to the present day as a 20-year period since 1995, can you say anything about what's going on in that area? Maybe you don't agree with what I'm talking about, but that's a particular template that I really like within the language framework myself, in my own practice and my own research. So if you don't agree with it, then it's fine. But if you want to say something about where we are since 1995, say 2015, I'd be very interested to hear your views.
So, is that where we are epistemologically, where we are?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about kind of.
Yeah, it could be as big as that, but I mean.
Where we are, I'm trying to get a sense of
the
question.
Sorry, yeah. I guess I'm thinking about colonialism and post-colonialism and the whole thing about language, and we say the paternal language, as Bart put it, with here we are today, as we have been virtually all our lives, using that same tongue to describe what our difference is, without actually putting a spotlight on a particular period in history of nearly 200 years, when that language was actually used deliberately as a tool to control the difference that separated people under colonialism. And it's now with media, with the 21st century, we're in the soup. We're all comfortable here talking about it, but just to draw attention to the period of time where that actually took place, that gagging, that silencing of the subjective experience and all of the meanings and knowledge that went with that, that wasn't allowed to be spoken, and you just had to shut up and do what you were told. So in relation to contemporary art practice, or maybe there's other areas that you want to mention, it's fine by me, but I'm just curious where we've come in the last 20 years on that kind of way of looking at the way the world is done.
Who wants to take that one?
Can I just say that I think it's remarkable, given that we live in the age of reality television and that everything is filmed, this itself is being documented, that the kind of register of filmic experience that we're looking at, kind of on-screen action, happens to be, references to mise en scène, Tarzan, film noir, all of which have a very important, role to play in the work of Fanon. But I'd argue
aren't necessarily people's frame of reference anymore. I don't know if people look to see themselves in experimental cinema so much as they do sitcoms and reality television shows. And I'm wondering why that, because I'm not a film person, but why that hasn't come up more as maybe challenging or causing a kind of certain rupture between this very sort of staged, scenic form of representation that you have been referring to by these incredibly skilled filmmakers who aren't, just making films for the sake of it, but who fundamentally have a kind of intellectual impetus.
That's actually a really good point. In terms of where people are looking for themselves, I think we have to talk about different audiences. And obviously when we talk about avant-garde and alternative forms of film and video, we're talking about 30 people. We're not talking about 30 million people that are looking for themselves either on Twitter or on reality television. So yeah, we have to talk about audience, language, who this speech, cinematic speech or written speech, spoken speech, whatever we want to call it, who this language is addressed to. Yeah, who is the audience? Who are these great artists making these films for? Is it just for those of us in this room who care and who want to be here and who keep these things to heart and talk about them? Is it for a wider audience? Obviously, most artists, artists in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, you want as often as wide an audience as possible for your work, or at least the chance to touch as many people as you can. These are important questions, yeah. What is this speech that we're dealing with, and who has access to it? Now we're talking about politics, now we're talking about access. These are all things that we dealt with today. Who has access to it? Who can have access to it? It's a question of outreach. Do we need to get it out there more? If so, how? We want to bring the bodies onto the screen, but how do we bring the bodies into the cinema also, or wherever it may be? Yeah, these are terribly important political questions and questions of this right to representation, this right to see, this ability to see. Like I was saying, it's, for me, 20 years ago when you were doing this exhibit, these aren't questions that I was thinking about, that questions that I was even interested in. But obviously with time, depending on where life takes you or what you do, it becomes a little bit more relevant. But yeah, this what we're doing here, what's being videotaped and recorded, or how do we get this out, and how do we let that have an impact? How do we sort of reach out and touch? That's a really important question. It is.
I think that's a question for you because
of my presentation.
Because of your presentation, but also just over 21 years ago. I mean, you weren't there right at the beginning. You are now part of an organisation which was a kind of late 20th century organisation, which has now become a 21st century, and so which I suppose goes back to our friend's question: what would be your thinking now in terms of the trajectory of that of INIVA in relation to what? Yeah.
It's interesting thinking about the passage of time of 20 years and where I was 20 years ago, and I had just discovered INIVA, and there obviously have been shifts in the landscape, but this might sound that maybe this will kind of, a sea of hands will come up now after I say this. I don't think that much has changed, that much within identity politics or in terms of representation. And the artists that I was talking about in my presentation, I think see it that way as well. They see themselves as agents, as giving voice to particular sensitivities, ideologies which were present 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Particularly if you think about Horace Ovey's film in 1969, the fact that it resonates so much with people who weren't even born 20 years ago. Yeah. And I think one of the things, if you're asking me about what does an institution do, what should it do now, reflecting on 20 years, imagining itself to be in the future 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, I would it's a question that I'm going to ask the audience, what is a useful institution? I think Alison said that this morning. What's a useful institution? How can it be useful to provide a platform for artistic practice which isn't about a restrictive institutional frame, but actually can be multiple things for multiple voices, can be sort of polyvocal. I love that expression. So that's my position. I've maybe sidestepped the question a little bit, but that's how I see INIVA operating in. Yes, there are shifts within social media, the way that people receive information, the way that information is transmitted. But actually thinking about the techno-diaspora and the digital diaspora and the questions that were being asked about the body in cyberspace 20 years ago, I kind of think there are so many connections with that today. It's just that we're doing it in different channels.
I want to actually follow on that, though. These points that we're raising in terms of change, this was sort of our running theme. Obviously, the name of the symposium is 20 years later. But what's interesting to me is, obviously, you're assembling a generation of, in cases, people that weren't actually there or maybe not so active at that time. But Fanon is interesting in this sense of what I've noticed. Almost everyone, I would even include myself, that presented today, even yourself yesterday, sort of prefaced things by saying, well, yeah, I like Fanon, but I'm not really an expert on Fanon. Or I use him sometimes, but I'm not really, I'm not do I have to be the guy that deals with post-colonial stuff? You got to call me for that? When you called me for this event, I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, you sent me to the library. I got, I got to brush up on my research. I thought you were setting me up. I thought I was going to be sitting on some, a panel with some hardcore post-colonialists, and if I don't know every line of Fanon word by word. But the interesting thing is almost everyone's reaction or preface was, well, yeah, Fanon, but I don't know if he's so relevant for me, or I don't know if I really need or want to use him so much now. Or, and when I sort of did this research and started working on, I found some really interesting things that I hadn't, I knew him, but, not intimately. We always read certain essays or certain passages or certain reference points, and we pick out things that are important for us to sort of focus on. And I found some really interesting things, some quotes that I use in my presentation, but also a lot of what I read, it felt dated to me. Yeah, this is dated. Yeah. I can feel the moment, but it's dated. It's useful, but I'm also questioning do we need him? And if so, how do we need him, and what do we need from him now in 2015?
But I think it's that amazing thing that there's an incredible exactitude to his writing in a way in which he reflects on the timeliness of the historical conditions he was born into. Yes. One can't just implicate themselves in that without at first signaling their naivety or their lack of understanding, and I don't ever claim to be to know for those very reasons that history has really kind of taken another turn. And I think that a lot of the things that came up in Melanie's talk, I mean, it would be really interesting to see some of the theory or some of the ideas that are being incubated around those sorts of practices, or in reflection to, the migrant crisis on the borders of France. And I don't feel that Fanon can do everything.
Yeah. Lal, and then there's somebody behind.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, you said. I just want to go record. I didn't express ambivalence, but I definitely am totally into the transgressive, brilliant Fanon and what he represented, you know what I mean, for me, and in all of its complicatedness. And so I just want to go on record for that. Very much in the way that Isaac articulated in his film, that it's something that's complex in the manner that Pasolini was, or Genet. But it's something that I can always return to, that having traveled, in many metropolises, whether, London, New York, living in Ghana, living in Tanzania in the mid-'70s, and seeing how necessary, even looking at the recent Panthers film, ambivalent relationship, but definitely something that I can draw on and to continually go to that well to get sustenance, despite its complicatedness. So the way I want to go on record that it's not that type of mamby-pansy, I'm not really sure, etc., that there is something that we could debate someone as complex and as rich and a genius and to, yes, I definitely want to go on record for that, and I think, that is the genius of, David having curated a show 20 years ago and revisiting that, because I think in a lot of ways, those issues, as George and I were talking over lunch, I was reading Henry Louis Gates' 91 Critical Fanonian for this particular conference. Prior to that, the most recent was Anthony Appiah's Prelude to Black Skin, White Mouse, and before that is Homi Bhabha. And since then, most recently, is Fanon, what Fanon said. So there is, in contrary to what you're saying, a reemergence, a critical rethinking of Fanon. So particularly, I was with an artist yesterday, and he knew I was in this conference. Well, what is related to Fanon? It still causes a certain type of rupture, whether in people's sense, well, that troubles the waters for people in seeing what this man could actually mean for someone today in 2015. So I just want to go on the record for that. But I thought you want to follow up with that, don't you?
Yes, I do. And there's a woman behind Ashford. There's also somebody behind as well. Yes, behind, yeah.
Of course, it's just incredibly stimulating, this conference, and I have a lot of reactions, but I do want to say, with a perspective of more like 40 years than 20, that when Fanon's work first came out, it was absolutely fantastic. It had a terrific impact on everybody. It was a way of looking that had not been presented before. And if it's not equally relevant now, I think we have to think about the history out of which that was generated. I want also to just refer to somebody who mentioned Bourdieu, because we have to be aware of the limitations of allowed discourse at each historical period. And also I'm wondering whether we have an opportunity to think of cinema as another institution, or is that too flexible a way to approach it? But I wanted to follow up on what Melanie had said by mentioning that we made a film in 1978 called Black's Britannica, which was the first film that located institutional racism in this country, and it was about the persecution of particularly young black people.
Colin Bristol.
Yeah, that's right. And I recently saw a film, which I hope other people will see, I don't know if you have, but it's called Those Who Feel the Fire Burning, and it's a Dutch film about the experience of migrants now. And what I'm wondering about a bit is, at the time we made Blacks, politically we defined black as a color, not a color of skin, but a political color, and a location of political experience, including bodily experience. And I think this film, Those Who Feel the Fire Burning, again, and like your reference to the Sudanese guy who walked through the tunnel, there's a way of looking at what has happened to the bodies of people who are victimized for one reason or another that I think is continuously reflected in cinema. And I would like to propose that, in a sense, that's another location that could be called an institution of exhibition.
George, do you want to? Oh, I think slide. Does anybody want to respond to?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Margaret. It's really important what you're talking about. I'm on the hunt for your film. I know about it. I remember it was at Radical Film Festival. I couldn't be in Bristol. I need that film. I got to see that film, because that ties into what I was mentioning in terms of this new program that I'm trying to develop, in terms of sort of these radical images and radical practices in terms of African cultures and bodies. But to your question, or what I sort of feel is sort of a tentative, maybe not tentative, but a proposition of what the cinema can be. You know, how useful can the cinema be? Correct me if I'm wrong. Your production was first shown on television, if I'm not mistaken. It was shown in cinema first and then television.
Well, it was complicated. It was briefly shown in cinema here, and then there was an injunction against the screening of the film. And it was shown once in Boston on PBS. Yeah. But there was a big mess and a lot of legal problems around it.
Yeah, this is so to this this desire for the cinema to function as this sort of a space where we can deal with these sort of things. I mean, obviously, I have belief in that desire. I'm a film guy. I'm a video guy. That's my first love. But I also love the very fact that this symposium is in a cinema. So this is great. I mean, this is where we are. We didn't have to be here. You could have put us in a conference room or something, but we're here in the cinema. So to me, that means a lot.
If you go to Foyle's bookshop now, you will find a whole section which is about 17 or more books about Fanon. 1995, you'll be lucky to find one. Okay, that's very important to think with. In 1995, if you had heard of anyone reading Fanon, it would be in community centres, in study groups. There was something of a black politics going on in Britain. There isn't one now. If you did come across it, as few of us who were teaching, and I could have counted them on one hand. I was 45 at the time. Fanon would be mentioned on some sort of elective as a footnote. Never mind the mainstream. Okay, so perhaps the question we have to ask now is, why now? What is it like to think with Fanon now? Okay. And it is in that moment that we are able to ask the conjunctural questions. And I do think it's important to think with Fanon. I do want to claim a little bit of knowledge about it, because some of the questions have preoccupied me for the most of my life. And I do think, even if one doesn't pay attention to it, the question of the gaze, the scopic, the look, in the image that David provided for that conference, for the Mirage, of the kiss, the black and white subject kissing. So Sonia's work. And in that image, nowadays, you guys take it for granted, walk down the road and hang together as transracial sex. In that moment, it was bloody dangerous. It's become dangerous in a different way. Okay, so thinking with Fanon does matter very much. Most so when the sites of thinking, and thinking is a very difficult thing to do, are disappearing. I'm talking about the attack on universities, the disappearance of the humanities, the disappearance of social sciences. The questions that Melanie raises are very serious. In some ways, they have not disappeared as they were. Internationalism in 1995, we might have thought it through the prism of South Africa, which incidentally is erupted in a Fanonian sense today as we speak. So those questions are still very much present now.
I don't want to get dubbed the institution man. It's really interesting, the notion that Fanon is dated. I don't want to get into a big argument about, he's more relevant than you realise. But I think that's quite a shift. The vanguard of the revolution, the Black Panther film, so interesting hearing the required reading matter of Black Panthers was Chairman Mao's Little Red Book and Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. So 50 years on from that, to say Fanon is dated is a historic moment. So it will be interesting to hear that sort of expanded a bit more and feel what are the things about his work now that don't touch you or us in our historical moment, and get a bit more detail about what that is. I also wanted to ask about Yasmina's piece and this connection with the call centre workers in India, because that's about cheap third world labour, those jobs not being done in Britain and the West because it's much cheaper to get Indian graduates to do it from there. And I was curious about the way that you talked about finding yourself placeless, and that not necessarily being something you'd encountered as an Algerian, French, from that background, but suddenly found yourself in the global economy as a consequence of this experience of being on Skype and having to talk to so many people in different countries and them not even knowing where you were. So your dislocation, do you think that was also linked to a racialized identity with some of those third world workers?
So there's two questions here, isn't there? There's the question...
I forgot the first one.
which is about Fanon and the kind of timeliness of your phrase, dated, which I think I'll take that second question, because I think that's a question I think we could actually use as a wrap-up for everybody to think about. But the other question was about how somehow your piece made him lure to the idea of the labour situation in those kind of call centres, and how somehow did you identify with that process in your performance piece?
Okay. I said that I kind of related to the sense of displacement, not on the labour part, obviously. I mean, conditions. I would never say that. But, yeah, the feeling of... it was more this feeling that they were working... I mean, each time I had this Skype meeting, the time was chosen somehow according to the other person, not according to my own time. So it's more like the rules, and also like, so if someone was available at 11 and it was 9 p.m. for me, I wouldn't go and have drinks with my friends. I would stay in front of my computer. Regarding this sense of, and displacement and no place, it wasn't at all related to my background, no. It was just, it's a like genuine feeling that I was, I don't know, I mean, it was, yeah, a feeling. I don't think I related to probably I related to France much more than Algeria, because I never lived there. It's the country of my parents. And so probably home, like, it would be more related to missing France, but it was more missing the UK. So it's a bit confused. We need to call Dr. Fanon. So I need to Skype with. Yeah, so that was more, in terms of setup, like the work, how the organization of the work, and that are related to the Indian workers, and the fact of, but they are going home after this time working in the call center. They go back home, and I wasn't. And regarding the dated, I know you said that. Yes. It was you. But probably it was you. But I'd like to, comment on this. The way I studied history, and I remember that I researched, it was Middle Ages history, and I always, my supervisor always told me that somehow I had to appropriate the knowledge of the predecessors, the historian who came before, and that I wasn't forced to quote them all the time, to say it came from them. That's why how I was educated. So in terms of, probably, I don't know if you mean that we, in 20 years, we appropriated the knowledge of created by Fanon, the questionings, and so probably we looking forward. So myself, I wouldn't say it's dated. The context, it's, we don't live this under these situations and this context, but I think we absorbed the knowledge, and we need to move on. I don't know. Maybe we need another another Fanon.
We do need another Fanon. We'll always need another Fanon. We'll need to regenerate Fanon. So let me start off with this dated comment that I threw out there, and obviously I'm catching a lot of flack for it. I'll take that. I don't mind. What I felt was dated was not necessarily the relevance of the political situation or the discussion. I'm very much concerned with aesthetics. Writing is my first love, even before cinema. So I'm very much concerned with the aesthetics of writing and critical writing. And the datedness I felt was more about the shape and form and tone of the polemic. That's what I sort of detected. That felt a little bit dated to me. Not necessarily that means it's a bad thing and I just discard Fanon. But that's more about what I felt, not necessarily about the politics or the situation, the residue of this colonial and post-colonial situation. Maybe it's not even post-colonial yet, but this residue, I don't mean to throw that away. Again, when I watched Julian's film last night, and I mean, even when I was reading Fanon and rereading him, that's my story, that's me. I can't throw Fanon away.
When you say you identify, did you get into specificity? Because I feel like that's vague.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking for the level of generosity when you saw that film. What exactly? Because I think there's a range of multiple positions you can identify with.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking for you is to get a little more, be more generous.
I will.
In what that actually means specifically.
I'll get real personal. It's like you got me now. I'm Creole. I'm from Los Angeles, but my grandmother came to Los Angeles from Louisiana right after the war. So when I see Fanon in this film and when I read about him and talking about where he's coming from, where some of my cultural roots are coming from, and when I see in Julian's film him sitting there by the radio and his parents standing above him, and he's talking about how, well, my dad looked like this, my mom looked like that. She wanted me to listen to that type of music. The other one wanted me to listen to that type of music. I see me. I hear stories about my grandfather and how they didn't even think he was black. He looked like he was straight white. So that's my story. That's my racial background. I probably got some folks that might even be related to him. Not even counting my folks coming from the Netherlands and France and so on and so forth. So when I say I see myself on that screen, I didn't have to wait to see me. That's me. I was that little kid in front of the radio. I was listening to hip hop. My parents were listening to jazz, Miles Davis. I was listening to Public Enemy. All right, but I want to just one more point. One more point. I want to follow up on the datedness, and I want to circle back to the Black Panthers, which is also something that's very close to me. I come from California. I was born and raised in LA, but I grew up in the Bay. That's the center of Black Pantherism for me. It's also the center of sort of independent black thought in terms of politics, in terms of culture, certainly in terms of hip hop. That's the home of independent hip hop. Now, when we talk about the Black Panthers, you mentioned two references that are very important, but you forgot a third. Maybe you didn't forget a third, maybe you just didn't mention a third. I'm gonna mention it because you already know what I love. Two things that you mentioned, and I'm only speaking about me and what I use, and whether it's dated or not, or what I choose to refer to when I write or not. I don't use Chairman Mao, I use Karl Marx, that's just me. I don't necessarily use Fanon. I'm in sort of a phase right now where I'm rereading James Baldwin, and that's who I like, and that's who I use, and that's who I sort of feel a universality. I love that you brought that film up. That's a masterpiece, and that's something that's really, really important. But I feel that spirit that's somehow transcends a little bit more with Baldwin, but maybe that's just because I'm rereading him now. I'm rereading Fanon now, thanks to you. There's a third reference that you didn't mention. Yes, Mao was required reading for the Panthers. Yes, Fanon was too. But the third point in this sort of triple point of education was, of course, a film. If you're gonna be a Panther, and if you're gonna be down with us, you have got to watch, without question, Melvin Van Peebles and his classic film, Sweet Sweetback. You already know that. So the power of cinema sort of stood on par with the force of this critical writing. Melvin Van Peebles, he's a hero to me, and also talking about this sort of independent black spirit, the blaxploitation era. That film sort of birthed the blaxploitation era. If I'm not wrong, it's still one of the most successful independent films of all time. So that's what it's about. That's what I'm drawn to. And that film has not dated to me one day. And I can still talk about that film. I can still write about the film, what that film shows and what that film does, its politics, its aesthetics, so on and so forth. That leaps across generations also. And that's something that moves me in terms of, like I was talking about, moving bodies and souls.
Osei, and then, did you want to say something?
If there's time.
There's a question.
I was just thinking about George and South Africa and my own journey through a PhD that took overly long because of epistemic violence, walls of citations, to quote Sarah Ahmed, and which began in South Africa in the 2000s, and memories of sitting in a seminar room and identity politics, a white woman professor saying, race is not an issue in this country anymore. And the struggle to talk about racial violence and try and understand what it is, what was this thing, apartheid. And then coming to the UK and starting a PhD again, and just one of the first supervision meetings was, Yvette, you know, if you're going to look at historical events in South Africa, you must cite only the best, and that means you will need to refer to the Cambridge historians, cite only the best. And my upgrade paper, these are all white South African women, by the way. My PhD upgrade paper was a ruckus because I was questioning agency, and I was trying to talk about the limits of agencies. I mean, abject racial violence within the particular conditions of South Africa. Examiner, Yvette, things have changed in South Africa now. You know, it's no longer the same. And that's why I think Fanon is so important to me. Right. I mean, how do you talk about racial violence? How do you talk about trauma? How do you talk about what's called identity politics? And how do you talk about epistemic violence? And I also don't. And there is this kind of geographical, temporal, where I sort of think that things are stagnant, that things have not really moved forward. And how do you talk about your own situatedness in conditions like South Africa? I mean, I was classified white, so I have a particular situated relationship to that material. And for me, Fanon opens, when he talks about the narcissism of whiteness and blackness, he opens a space for me to think about that in my own situated relationship.
I've got one more who's been waiting. You had your hand up, and then I'm going to have to do a little bit of a wrap-up, I'm afraid. Yes, I am going to do a wrap-up.
I want to go back to the point where there's this discussion going on when things are not changing and it's stagnant. For the history of racism, has it moved on? I don't think it has. I've only been on Earth for 35 years, but when looking back on like the history, it seems like nothing's really changed. We've just got technology that kind of makes us move a bit differently. But one thing, as I'm an activist, I believe in resistance, physical resistance as well, direct actions as well. I believe in we need to unite as humans and as people of. I don't like to use the term people of colour, but as the political black, it needs to unite. So that means that the Asians and the Browns and the black people, they unite together, they work together, they dismantle this kind of system of racism. And also that kind of means that, you know, the bridge between the working class and the middle class kind of dismantles as well. Because I mean, there's actually a protest right now, well, that was going on a couple of hours ago on Downing Street about police murders. And yeah, again, that's sort of like a black working class crowd. And then I enter this space, you know, which is really interesting. But there's obviously like bridges. I mean, there's boundaries, you know, within the races at the moment as well, which I think need to dismantle as well if you want to move ahead and unite. That's all.
Did you want to say?
Yeah, it's just a point. I mean, I don't feel very connected to a lot of the different forms of imaging Fanon. I don't necessarily think it's healthy to have someone carry such a symbolic burden. I think that there's something deeply problematic about this need to see oneself in someone else, rather than seeing one's own self in the mirror and reflecting on who that person might be or could be, the potentiality of
of the self as the most prominent, sort of the most important location of identity. And I just think that in relation to going back to the quote I first mentioned in relation to Fanon, he said, in no way do I have to dedicate myself to reviving black civilization unjustly ignored. So I don't think this idea of pulling up Fanon is useful. It's more this question of how you use it as a toolbox. Yes. I guess in the way that Hans-Ulrich Obrist has referred to Edward Glissant as a way of thinking through new concepts, but not necessarily to feel as though becoming so theoretically entangled in the questions of Glissant was the best way in which to act out Glissant's ideas. And I just wanted to kind of put that on the table.
Yes, yes. George wants to say something.
I think it's important to make a distinction between...
Very short though, George.
I think it's important to make a distinction between generation and generative. Or it's most important to make... which was very clear in the Mirage season.
Yes.
Thinking with Fanon was not the same thing as following Fanon.
Yes.
Okay, and it's a very important distinction, because the question now then means, what does it feel like to think with Fanon?
Yes, I was going to actually say that.
We need really to crystallize that.
Yes, sorry, I was actually going to say that, but you've actually said that for me, because it's 20 years for me to do that. Yes, and to reflect upon that. All I can say is, for me, several things. Actually, I will say, okay, for me, right, I'm born on the 28th of December, so I don't get a party for my birthday. I get a Christmas card. And it's like, well, this is, well, okay, you gave me a party once. And it's like, and I get like, happy Christmas, this is your birthday present as well as your Christmas present. So this was meant to be my party to make up for, 20 years I've not had a party for my birthday and my Christmas. Having said that, I wanted to mark this occasion and also use it to say, what is the next series of projects we can do now? My interest now is about thinking through about, in 2017, I want to do another Mirage season, taken from the discussions we've had the last 2 days, and also the discussions I've had throughout the year, trying to think through what it is I want to do curatorially as a project. Sorry, I wanted to address the person behind Lara. Sorry, you didn't say what your name... Yeah, just to say to end for me on a personal note, one of the things that changed the way that I worked after I did Mirage was for me to think more politically. So the project I'm working on at the moment is with an organisation called Platform, which is in the coalition with Amnesty and with Greenpeace, and it's to deliver a memorial to the activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a poet and writer who fought for the Ogoni rights in Africa, but who was executed 20 years on the 10th of November this year. And we made a memorial. My intervention was to work with Platform, Greenpeace, Amnesty, and to commission a memorial to Ken Saro-Wiwa, which we did with Sakari Douglas Camp. It toured this country for over 10 years. We've now taken it to Nigeria to commemorate for the Ogoni people. It's been impounded. It's been censored by the government. We're now raising issues around that to make it more visible in terms of what they're doing. But only just to say that the notion of Fanon, how that changed me curatorially was to make me think and work politically in a different dimension I wouldn't think was totally possible in the last 20 years, which now makes me now think, what is it now possible to do in the next 20 years? And I want to bring all of you onto that journey. So can we really thank everybody who spoke today, particularly Catherine and the wonderful Ashford and team of the ICA. And let's talk about what we can do next over the next couple of years to make this happen. And please join me for a drink in the bar so we can talk about that further. Thank you very much. You've drank all the champagne, George, so there's none left.